Namaste, everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of the EkaShri podcast. And just as a quick refresher, so everyone is aware, for those of you who are new to this podcast episode, we are basically taking these different 30 to 45-minute episodes where we discuss key concepts within yoga philosophy. And the goal of the podcast isn't just to give sort of more the textbook explanation on a particular topic, but rather to explore the topic in an accessible way and focus on the real-world applications of these topics and how we can actually apply them to modern life. So like we've been doing in the past, the podcast will be in a Q&A format with several pre-prepared questions, but the discussion will really flow based on what we touch upon in these different topics and based on the bullet points that we've put together. And hopefully you'll find it to be an interactive conversation where we'll be able to all learn something new through the podcast. So if you have any subjects and topics that you would like to suggest after listening to these different podcast episodes, definitely feel free to email us at info@ekashri.yoga and let us know. And so with that, why don't we go ahead and get started for our topic for today, where we'll be talking about asanas in today's episode. So namaste, Shriramji. So thank you again for contributing to the discussion and your time here today to talk about asanas. So I think why don't we start just by level setting with asanas? I think this is probably the most accessible term in probably the yoga philosophy that I think people of any background, will be able to understand, just because this represents the physical postures that we tend to do in our yoga practice, right? And so asanas represent the third limb in the Ashtanga Yoga philosophy that we've been studying so far. We talked about the yamas and the niyamas a couple of weeks ago, and today we're focused on the third limb, or asanas. And so at the highest level, Shriramji, we know that asanas are the physical postures, but obviously there's a lot more to delve into within asanas and what they actually represent. So to you, Shriramji, what does the word asana, I guess, first of all, actually mean?
Thank you. Namaste, everyone, and namaste, Vedantji. So you are right. Asanas are perhaps the most visible part of yoga. In fact, most people associate yoga with asanas. So when they talk about the subject of yoga, perhaps most likely they are referring to the practice of body postures inside a yoga mat. So in that sense, asanas is very ubiquitous in the yoga world. But when we explore the deeper mechanisms in yoga, the deeper dimensions of yoga, we discover that asanas is one slice of the broad spectrum of yoga. So asanas is one of the limbs. It's the third limb of 8-limbed practice of yoga. So what are asanas, right? The word asanas comes from the root word asti, to be. And the word as is to sit stably. So the practice of allowing the body to be in a stable position, at the same time in a comfortable position, so that we can transcend the body and allow the mind to be in a place of meditation. So that is basically the objective of asanas. We are not tormented by the concerns of the body when we want to go deeper in meditation. My teacher used to give a very beautiful analogy. If we think of the body as a vehicle, we want to park the vehicle when we go and enjoy the scenery. If you go to a scenic place, you want to park the car, and you want the car to be in a safe place where nobody will steal it, and it is there when you come back, and you don't have to constantly think about whether the car is safe or not. You enjoy the scenery, and then when you get back, the car is there. Like that, you park the body, you park the vehicle, and then we transcend the body. We forget the body for the time being when we are going into meditation. So in this sense, asanas are a very integral practice, because remember, the objective of yoga is to silence the mind. Yoga's chitta vritti nirodha, Patanjali says. The state of yoga is to quiet the mind so that the mind is tranquil, and from a tranquil mind, we have the access to creative ideas and intuition and so forth. So if you want to get in touch with that space, if our mind is trapped by the concerns of the body, then we have not reached that place of tranquility. The body is still bothering us. It makes its presence felt by its discomforts. So with asanas, we park the body, we allow the body to situate stably in one posture so that when we are in meditation for longer and longer periods of time, perhaps 20 minutes or half an hour or 1 hour, then the body assists us. It doesn't resist our practice of meditation. It assists us in the practice of our meditation. So in that sense, asanas is a very integral practice of yoga. If we don't do asanas, if we simply sit with our eyes closed, then we are caught up in the discomforts of the body. There is pain in the lower back, or the knee hurts, or itching sensation here and there. So there are so many disturbances that the body can provide to the mind. So we want to transcend that. And that's exactly why we have the practice of asanas.
Got it, got it. And that makes a lot of sense. And I think, as you mentioned, right, that one key point where when you're in the final asana, right, the goal is to be in that sort of steady state, right, where you're just, remaining and basically, like you said, right, to be. And so you shouldn't have any of that sort of, it should be a very comfortable position, which is why we say you want to stretch, but not to the point where you're hurting yourself and you're uncomfortable in that final position, right? So that makes a lot of sense. And so I'm wondering though, if the goal of asanas, right, is a physical practice. And obviously through the asanas, we, want to get some kind of physical benefit for the body, stretch the body, but at the same time, it's much more than that. How do we reconcile the fact that, each time as you practice the asanas, right, the goal is to get a little bit better at the asanas, right? So whether it's stretching a little bit further, bending a little bit, forward or backward a little bit more, right? You have to get a little bit uncomfortable in order to stretch the body a little bit more in order to then push yourself towards new sort of goals each time you do it, right? So how do you reconcile that concept with the goal of asanas, where the whole focus here is to be very happy, comfortable, and stable in that final position?
That's a good question. So how do we expand our comfort zone, right? Because
Exactly.
we can, if we were to be completely entrenched in the comfort zone, then perhaps we become lazy. We don't give ourselves the opportunity to go to the boundary of the comfort zone. So we can be a couch potato, right? It's comfortable there. But of course, couch potato, although initially there is some comfort there is no stability there. It is not sustainable. If we simply allow the body to plop, just go into a couch potato mode, then we discover in 5 minutes that it is not sustainable. We cannot seat ourselves comfortably for extended periods of time. Not only that, slouched posture will have its effect manifest in the mind as well. The mind may not be too alert when it is not steady. So how to expand the comfort zone and what are the steps in asanas? There are actually four principles that are given in the Yoga Sutras. How to approach the practice of asanas? There are four principles, and one of them talks about the question that you have raised, namely about the comfort zone and how to expand the comfort zone. So perhaps let's walk through what are the four principles of asanas. So before we get into it, I want to highlight the fact that all the practices within asanas that we do, stretching or strengthening or inverted postures, etc., all of them, the primary goal is to pick one posture where we can seat ourselves comfortably for long periods of time. For example, in a cross-legged position or sitting on a chair. In order to sit on a chair or in the cross-legged position on a yoga mat for long period of time, like say 1 hour, all the practice that we do in asanas help us towards that objective. So when we take the practice of a specific yoga posture, specific asana, there are four principles that Patanjali describes. And so the first two principles are called Shriram and Sukham. So there's a sutra in Patanjali Yoga Sutras, Sthira Sukham Asanam. The definition of a yoga posture is when the body is in a place of comfort and stability. Sthiram is stability or steadiness, and Sukham is comfort. And we will see a little bit later a deeper meaning of the word Sukham. So when we approach a yoga posture, these two things should be in our mind. Is the posture comfortable? And is the posture steady? So those are the first two. And we will explore this a little bit more in a few moments. The next two he details in the next sutra. He says Prayatna Shaitalya Ananta Samapatibhyam. So the third principle is Prayatna Shaitalya. Prayatna means effort. So asanas involve effort. And what is the effort for? In order to hold the posture steady and comfortable. Sometimes it might take us towards the boundary of the comfort zone. So effort is needed. But it is not too much effort where it becomes a torture to the body. So we go to the edge of the comfort zone, and then with practice, you bring it inside the comfort zone. In other words, the boundary of the comfort zone has expanded. So whenever we try to learn something new, we have to train ourselves till it becomes second nature, right? Till it becomes a habitual process where we don't have to spend effort on it. Like that, we offer the same practice towards the asanas. When we are doing a new asana, perhaps the first time when we do it, it requires a lot of effort and struggle. But Shaitalya happens when the effort is, it becomes effortless. There's a transformation where the effort becomes effortless. So that is Prayatna Shaitalya. So offer effort, and then in due course of time, that effort becomes effortless. So you take the next step, go a little bit more towards the edge of the comfort zone and make that effortless. So that's how we grow the zone of comfort. And then the fourth principle is Ananta Samapatti. Ananta means endless or infinite, and here it refers to something that transcends the body, because the body is limited, limited in space and limited in time as well. So Ananta means that which transcends the body. So, say the universal truths or something that is infinite, if we can imagine that in our mind. So take your awareness there. The Samapatti means the equilibrium state of mind that is focused on the infinite. Another way to state that is, when we are in that yoga posture, allow your mind to transcend the body, transcend the limitations of the body. So these are the four principles that Patanjali has given. And some of these we have to contemplate, and we have to inquire deeper what exactly does it mean. And perhaps we will go through this once again in a few moments. So let me just pause here, and perhaps you have some questions on this.
Yeah, no, I think it'll definitely be good when we go through all of the different four concepts in a little bit more depth. But I really like how you explained it. And it seems like there's also that in those four steps, right? There is sort of a progression where you have the very most superficial, the most physical level, starting with stability, right? Because you just need to make sure the body is balanced, for example. Then from there, it's comfort and happiness, which is like one layer deeper. And then after that, it's about, okay, you have that comfort and happiness, but now it's about, I like the way you put it, where effort becomes effortless over time, right? And so you then start to expand that level of, physical ability and that effort, and where you can stretch and how good you can stretch. And then finally it goes almost to the mental level, right, where you're allowing the mind to transcend the body. So it just seems like there's that progression as you go into that final asana. You start physically, but then there's so many different layers to peel back on that. So I really like the way you've explained it, and I think it really encapsulates what our audience should be thinking about when they do a final practice. And, we often have to hold it for, 20, 30 seconds, or sometimes even longer. And so that's why we keep emphasizing that you want to find that comfortable position, right, that you can hold and maintain for, the next couple seconds, for 20, 30 seconds, or even a minute or longer, whatever you're doing specifically. But the goal is to then hit these four different steps and really be able to think through and rationalize those things as you're in the final position. So I think that's really really well explained. And maybe we should dive into the four topics a little bit more in depth, just so that we can do a little bit more justice to them. And I think, the first one, right, Shriram and Sukham, those are two of the more sort of, I would say, I think, easier to grasp, right, when it comes to understanding these 4 different concepts, just because, you need stability to be able to maintain that final position. And then you need happiness, of course, or you need comfort in order to, be able to actually hold it there in the final position. So I think we can probably spend maybe just a little bit of time on those 2, but I think on number 3 and number 4, if we can dive a little bit more to those 2 and kind of have our audience get a little bit more of a grasp on what they entail, that'll be helpful.
That's an excellent point. And thanks for that very beautiful observation. So we start with the sthiram, which is the most physical aspect. And then as we expand to the other 3 principles, we are actually transcending from the level of the body to something higher. So let's once again go through these 4 principles so that there is more clarity on it. So the first is sthiram. And as you rightly said, so we have an idea about what stability is, and the practice of stability can be interpreted in 2 ways. When we do asanas, there are 2 types of stability. One stability is, suppose we stray away from the point of equilibrium, how easily are we able to come back to center? You see, in physics, we talk about stable equilibrium versus unstable equilibrium. In an unstable equilibrium, you have, for example, like a little ball that is perched very precariously at some spot, and one tiny nudge and the whole thing falls apart, right? That's an unstable equilibrium. Whereas a stable equilibrium is if we push it, so it goes out of center for a few seconds, but slowly it comes back. Or to give a real world example, if somebody provokes you, and suppose the mind gets perturbed, say it gets angry for a few moments, how quickly are we able to come back to center? Or does it disrupt the mind and we go into a rage, you see? So how quickly we come back to stability. So that is sthiram. That is one way to interpret sthiram. Another way to interpret sthiram is when the whole body has one organic unit. In other words, the whole body it doesn't have multiple centers of gravity. It is one stable object. Then there is sthiram. Let me give an example. Supposing I stretch my arm to one side. I'm stretching my left arm here, and you can see that perhaps. So if I keep the arms very loose, then there is no stability there, right? Whereas if the arm is stable, that means if somebody were to pull my arm, the whole body will come along with it. If the arm is not stable, if it is loose, if somebody were to pull my arm, only the arm will move, you see? That is not stable. That is, the body has multiple centers of gravity. So when the whole body is one unit, it's like a chair. You pull one leg of a chair, the whole chair moves along with it because it's a stable object. So stability can also be measured this way. The whole body is one unit. Otherwise, when the body is limp or loose or like a couch potato, you pull one limb of the body, only that part moves. So that is a measure of instability. It is not in a place of sthiram. So this is another way to understand sthiram. So that is one aspect. That's the first principle. And is that clear, Vedantji, or you think there are any questions around that?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and especially having the stability, right? So it makes a lot of sense the way you've put it, because you also likely, just from a physiological perspective, right? If you're like, for example, you take something like a lateral bend, right? Ardha Chakrasana, if you're sitting there with the elbows bent or, you're like loose and stuff, first of all, you get no benefit from the practice, but then that potentially opens you up to injuries and stuff like that because your body is not actually stretching in the way it should be. And I think that's also important because then it also relates to the thing about, in that stability, even though you have, your arms straight and stuff, you're also not overextending. You're not over, locking your joints, for example, to the point where you could be injuring yourself, right? So there's that narrow, fine line between, going overboard versus, not, reaching your full sort of physiological capacity of what you can do. So I think, no, that definitely makes sense. And I think that's something that our audience, I think, once you get into the final practice, that's something you have to feel for yourself. Right, we can discuss this a lot here, but I think once you get into the final position, you kind of will be able to intuitively tell where your sort of final point is, because any further you go, you're going to start feeling these pains, and any less, if you're just bent at the elbow and stuff, you just won't feel, a good enough stretch, right? You'll feel like you're under stretching. So I think, it takes time to find that final, that proper final position for you or for each member of the audience. But I think over time, as you practice, you will be able to find that and then start extending it so that you can then reach this new normal, right? Like you can do in order to basically deepen your stretch each time you go into the practice.
Yes, and in fact, the second principle, which is Sukham, so that is actually a complementary side of Sthiram. So you mentioned over stimulating or perhaps over stiff, too much of stability. If we are trying to exert too much, maybe stretching the arm, and then it becomes so effortful, then there is no Sukham there. There is no ease there. So Sukham without Sthiram is fragile. It becomes very fragile. Sthiram without Sukham becomes very brittle. You see, can easily be shaken when there is no ease to move in the Sukham. It becomes very brittle. So a combination of both, it's like a seesaw. This combination brings the perfect balance in the yoga posture. So Sthiram, we saw stability, and Sukham is also interesting. So what does it exactly mean, comfort and ease? The word Sukham itself is interesting. Sukham comes from two words. Kham means space. The literal meaning of the word kham in Sanskrit, it means space. Sukham, su is a prefix, and Sukham literally means comfortable space, or there is freedom to move. We don't feel restricted. When we feel restricted, it becomes dukkham. When we feel ease, when we have the freedom in the body and in the mind, then we feel sukham. There's comfortable space there. So the way Krishnamacharya, the great the father of modern yoga, how he used to interpret this as Sukham literally means the ease with which we are able to breathe. Because what is it in the body that is most intimately connected to space? So it is the lungs, right? So when we expand the space in the lungs, we allow the air to flow in to the system. So our respiratory apparatus is most closely associated with space. So how do we measure Sukham? How can we find out whether the yoga asana practitioner is in a place of comfort and ease? It is easily checked by listening to their breath. When the breath is flowing steady, smooth, not haphazard, not choking, that means they are at ease. Because when the body feels tormented or when there is too much struggle, when we're doing a posture, when there is no Sukham, we can still fake a smile. It's possible. So just by looking at their smile, we cannot say whether there's Sukham or not. But the breath will never lie. So as a yoga teacher, when we go around the class, not in a Zoom class, of course, but in a physical class, when we go around, when we hear their breath, that's an indication whether they are in Sukham or are they struggling. So the second principle is intimately connected to the breath. So the first is stability, and the second, the Sukham, is to do with the breath, where breath requires movement. It requires movement of the diaphragm. It requires movement of uh, the abdominal cavity and the thoracic cavity and so forth. So they are complementary to each other.
And that makes a lot of sense, Shriram. I think, that's why we also in the class emphasize, right? You need to make sure your breathing is normal, right? Make sure it's not getting superficial. Make sure it's not becoming a little, you don't find yourself short on breath. And so to our audience, that is the exact reason why we, say you need to focus on your breath and use your breath as a tool to kind of guide you into that final position, right? And that final posture that you're holding within the asana. Because if you don't have the breathing, right, like you said, Shriram, those two go hand in hand, and they're incredibly well they're very tightly connected, right? And so you can't have one without the other as well, because you just, you
Exactly.
can, right? And so even if you try to, I think it's very anatomically and physiologically, it might prove difficult to try to do one over the other. So I think, for our audience, I hope that serves as sort of a point to further underscore why, it's incredibly important that your breathing remains stable and remains normal as you normally would breathe, and use that as a guide and as an instrument to tell you whether you're pushing yourself too far into a stretch versus not stretching enough. So hopefully that's very helpful for our audience to keep in mind.
In fact, my teacher used to make the comment that asanas is truly a breathing practice, because most people have this idea that asanas are physical practices, physical posture. Pranayama is the breath work, or that's where the focus on breath is. But when we really look at the practice of asanas, the primary key in asanas is actually the breath, because that's where our focus is. Whether the breathing is smooth, it is unhurried, and it flows easily. There is no struggle in the breath. So we can think of asanas as primarily a breathing practice, and we are allowing the body to go through various postures, and where we allow the breath to remain in the same equilibrium state, in the same ease in all these postures.
Wonderful. That sounds very true, and that's hopefully a good sort of point of reinforcement for the people in the audience. And so, to the last point, Shriramji, right? I think you mentioned we said the last point is allowing the mind to transcend the body, right? And so that's a very powerful phrase and a very powerful concept. So when you're in the final asana, holding it, right? So obviously we've talked about the whole concept of the monkey mind, and even for things like pranayama and meditation, it's very hard, and breathing more broadly, right? It's very hard to get the mind to focus because the mind is wandering about different things. So how, for those in the audience who are just beginning on their yoga journey and their yoga practice, personally, how should one think about using the mind as a tool to transcend the body? And how do you even begin to, practically apply that into yoga practice when you're holding that final posture?
In fact, it is built into the practice of asanas, and let me try to explain how that happens as part of the process. So let's first recall that sutra where he makes the 2 points, the principle 3 and principle 4. So principle 3 is prayatna shaitilya. That means offer effort, and in due course of practice, the effort becomes effortless. It becomes second nature. Now, when we offer effort to bring the body to the edge of the comfort zone, whenever we are at the edge of our comfort zone, it requires our full attention, right? Perhaps we can think about it for a bit. When we are fully in the comfort zone, our mind can multitask and we can do many things, it can get distracted and so forth. But when you are doing something new, which is slightly beyond the zone of comfort, our full mind should be there with the action or with that practice, right? For example, when somebody is trying to learn how to balance on a bicycle, if it's the first time they're doing it, their full attention is there. They cannot be talking to their neighbor. They can do that after it becomes second nature, right? But when they are at the boundary of their comfort zone, their full attention has to be there. So look at how the one-pointedness of the mind comes with the practice of yoga. And in fact, when we look at the variety of yoga postures, there are many postures where the primary emphasis is actually on the mind. And a classic example of that is balancing postures, right? When we are balancing, say, standing on one leg, or when we are doing balancing postures, say arm balance or a headstand, there are a variety of balancing postures. In balancing postures, the quality of the physical balance of the body is largely determined by how balanced or how stable the mind is. If the mind is distracted, on those days on which the mind is distracted, you will notice the body also is wobbly when we hold the balancing postures. So you see, as part of the asana practice, there are so many postures where the mind has to be in that space of one pointedness. It compels the mind to be one-pointed. So it comes as part of the practice. So that is why we have to keep expanding the comfort zone, because after some time, with some continued practice, what was effortful in the beginning becomes effortless now, and then the mind can wander. So we need to find our new boundary and keep expanding the zone of comfort. So that is prayatna shaitilya. So that's why Patanjali does not say just shaitilya. He says prayatna first, put effort first, and then go to that space of effortlessness. So slowly expand the zone of comfort. And when we do that, the last principle, the fourth principle is Ananta Samapatti. We transcend the body and the mind is securely in a place of what Patanjali calls infinite. It is not trapped by the limitations of the body. It is thinking of something, or it is situated in something that is eternal. So that is the Ananta Samapatti, and it comes with the practice of asanas. And anyone who has practiced asanas, even for a few classes of yoga asana practices, you would have noticed that by the time we complete the class, or by the time we complete the sequence of postures, the mind has undergone a transformation. The mind is more quiet, mind is more alert, and the mind is no longer tormented by the body. The body feels light, and so forth. So that transcending the body and allowing the mind to be in that place of infinity, it comes as part of the process. My teacher used to give the example of, you just place yourself at the conveyor belt and do all these processes, and by the time you come out of it, you are a finished product. The mind is now not jumping around, it is stable, it is serene, it is tranquil, and so forth.
And I think that is such an important point you mentioned, right? About how to prevent that monkey mind. Again, these things go hand in hand, right? And it just further shows the benefits of how intertwined the mental and physical aspects of asana practice is, right? Because like you put it, right? I mean, in order to focus the mind, you need to push the body, right? And we don't mean pushing in a bad way, but pushing to, again, get to that new sort of outside of your comfort zone and bring that, and so basically widen that comfort zone so that that new stretch becomes the new normal for you when you go into that position going forward. And exactly like you said, right? I mean, if the position is too easy, it's like, for example, developing resistance to something, right? Where something becomes incredibly easy for you to do because you start doing it so many times over and over. Then again, like you mentioned, like you put it, right? You can easily multitask. Your mind will be thinking about something else, but only when you're actually pushing yourself and there's some kind of new stimulus that you're not used to, right? The body then goes into the state of, very single-minded, unified focus and attention, which is I think what we are talking about here. And so that's a very interesting point. I think that, the mental and the physical are much more intertwined together, and they kind of go hand in hand in order to, improve on each dimension, right? So you can't have one without the other. And they both rather are, two intertwined topics that you need to basically pursue in tandem in order to get the benefits from each one individually. So I think that's an incredibly important point that hopefully our audience has been able to grasp, because when they start thinking about their practice going forward, that'll be something that'll be important to keep in mind as to how to benefit them both, physically and mentally in all their yoga practices going forward. So Shriramji, on that topic, eyes closed versus eyes open. What are your thoughts on, just the general concept of keeping the eyes closed versus the eyes open? Is there as dramatic of a difference between one or the other, or what is the general guidance you would have for people when they're in that final position, eyes open versus eyes closed? How should, we be thinking about that?
In fact, it is contextual. So one of my teachers, who is also an expert on Ayurveda, so he talks about how, based on the unique nature of the body or unique constituent of the body, the vata, pitta, kapha energies that are flowing in the body, so it should be personalized. The practice of yoga should be personalized, tailor-made to that specific body type. So there are some body types that benefit with doing the practice with eyes open, and whereas some others might find it more beneficial with eyes closed. And for yet others, it doesn't really matter. They have a choice. They can either close their eyes or open. It doesn't really matter. For example, when is it a good idea to close the eyes? So if we want a more introverted practice, and if the mind can easily get distracted, then keeping the eyes open may not be such a good idea. So we want to go deeper in meditation. We want to conserve the awareness so that we don't dissipate it or get distracted outside. We want to conserve the prana and bring it inwards. So closing the eyes in that situation helps. Whereas opening the eyes might be beneficial if the body is too lethargic, or if it can go to slumber, for example, rather than going into Sukham. If the For example, when we are holding a comfortable posture, perhaps there is drowsiness or lethargy that kicks in, then perhaps it's a good idea to keep the eyes open in that situation. So, and there are also variations based on the specific posture. For example, most people find that holding balancing postures is easier when we keep the eyes open. And once it becomes easy to hold the posture, the balancing posture, to increase the challenge, to go to the next level of the comfort zone, right? To expand the comfort zone even a bit beyond that, perhaps we can add this challenge of closing the eyes in the balancing posture. So these are some of the things to consider as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. And so I think that should give our audience and me myself as well something more to think about as we continue in the asana practice, and how we think about the more subtleties of when we're in that final posture. Things should be keep our eyes open or closed, like you just so beautifully explained. And then of course the 4 different concepts we talked about within the asanas, right? About how we transcend from the most physical, superficial level all the way down to the mind. And I think after this discussion here, I'm starting to understand why I think we talked about the first week or so, we discussed Ashtanga Yoga. Why are the physical postures, asanas, not the first limb of Ashtanga Yoga? And it makes sense in this context of this discussion that, with the yamas and the niyamas, you kind of need that as sort of preconditioning, right? To then be able to have a very fruitful asana practice. Because again, I think if the yamas and niyamas are not in place, you will have a lot of mental distractions. You will have a lot of physical distractions around you. And I'm thinking about things like saucha, right? Cleanliness, things like happiness there. So you need to almost have that to precondition as sort of your prep work before you do asana practice, because there's the physical practice, and being able to get the most physically out of the body and out of these practices is so intimately linked, like we explained before, right? To not only the mental, but to your surroundings, your internal awareness, and your internal environment. So all of these things are sort of moving together in parallel. And so that's why it's so important that we have really taken care of all of these limbs together in parallel, versus just trying to isolate one of the limbs, right? Versus and then just focusing on that.
In fact, we can apply the principles of yama and niyama as part of the asana practice as well. For example, we can practice ahimsa, not to bring the body to such a place of pain where we go far beyond the zone of comfort, and then it becomes a torture to the system. So sometimes when people are driven to reach the goal very quickly, they're determined to touch their toes, and perhaps they're willing to bear a little bit more pain to achieve that target sooner. Perhaps it's not a good idea, because we don't want to introduce injury into the system. So we take it step by step. And in fact, in thermodynamics, it is called the reversible process, where we take one small step at a time to expand the comfort zone, rather than trying to go all the way out there. And what it does is it creates wear and tear in the system. So we are going against the principles of ahimsa. So like that, introducing yamas and niyamas as part of the asana practice is very helpful. In fact, in Ashtanga Yoga, it is a necessity. We follow all the limbs of yoga together. They go in tandem. And of course, we can introduce the other aspects. For example, tapas. Tapas literally means austerity, or to heat, to the willingness to step a little bit outside the comfort zone for the sake of long-term joy. So all this we can integrate into the practice of asana.
Yep, that's very true. And I think hopefully our audience will be able to recognize that a little bit more. And that's just something that's food for thought, I think, to leave them with as we think about yoga practice and how, it's so much more than just when you think about asanas, right? It's so much more than just getting on the mat, quickly doing something, holding it for 30 seconds, and then getting out, right? There's so much more to actually internalize and think about. Um, when you're doing your actual physical practice. So hopefully this provides some context and some whatever framework for them to think about as they step onto the mat next and do the next round of physical asanas and keep that going into their yoga toolkit. So before we end for today, Shriramji, I think one more practical question that would be very helpful to get your perspective on is, how should we, if we're beginners, right? We're getting started with yoga practice. We're just starting to build a routine and build some kind of a rhythm with the practice. How should we think about incorporating asanas, one, into our daily lives, and two, into the broader, scope of our yoga practice, whether that's a daily practice, a weekly practice, whatever it may be. And what advice would you give to maybe some of our listeners who are looking to start a personal asana practice or refine their existing practice?
In fact, the best way to bring momentum to our practice of yoga, especially the practice of yoga asanas, would be to experience the benefit firsthand so that when the benefits are obvious, we are encouraged or inspired to keep up with the practice every day. It becomes a joy to do the practice of yoga asanas. So we jump into the yoga mat with enthusiasm and excitement and with joy, with a big smile on the face, right? Not because, oh, I took a New Year's resolution and we have to drag the body inside the yoga mat and the body is kicking and screaming and it becomes an obligation. It's not like that at all. Just a few days of practice, we discover, wow, the body feels so light. And from my own personal experience, I've been practicing yoga asanas for more than about 35 years now. And I practice regularly every day. And even today, the practice of yoga is there is something fresh about it. Yoga asanas is so fresh. Wow, it makes the body feel so light. At the end of the yoga asanas, just sitting on a chair, the body feels so good. Wow, it feels incredible. This body, in Sanskrit, it's called Anga Lagavam. Anga Lagavam means the lightness of the body. You can actually feel it. So once you have a taste of these benefits, then automatically the willingness to keep up with the practice will come on its own. Will be inspired to do it on their own. I'd also like to mention that especially for beginning students, if you're considering the practice of yoga asanas, there are something that are very unique to the practice of yoga asanas, which perhaps we don't find in other systems of exercise. Now, all systems of exercise, they have their own unique features. Every one of them bring benefits to the system. What is unique about yoga asanas is when we talk about yoga, we usually associate with holistic practice. In the context of asanas, the practice is holistic in the sense that it attends to all parts of the body. In that sense, it is holistic. For example, some systems of exercise, they target a few muscles or a few joints. So for example, when we go for a long walk, maybe that is the exercise, perhaps, and it's a very good exercise. And I do that myself, going on long walks, etc., on a regular basis. But it exercises certain muscle groups more than others. Now, the practice of asanas, there is emphasis on all the major muscles and all the major joints of the body. And in some practices, such as Sukshma Yoga, we also target subtle organs like the eyes, the ears, and so forth, the sense of vision, sense of hearing, and all that. So the point is, it is a holistic system in that it attends to all parts of the body and it brings benefit to all the systems of the body, not just the musculoskeletal system. Most people associate yoga with stretching, but that is a very oversimplification. In fact, not only the practice of yoga has benefits for the muscles and joints, it also benefits the digestive system, the respiratory system, the circulatory system, the kidneys, all the body parts, not just the muscles and bones, but also the internal organs. they benefit through the practice of asanas. Let me give a very simple example of how it benefits the circulatory system and especially how it benefits the heart. So, in order to help the heart to keep the circulation of blood moving brisk in the system, so for example, when we stand, the heart is about two-thirds of the way up from the ground, right? And when the blood that is moving in the lower extremities, such as our feet, it has to find its way back to the heart. So it has to work against gravity, right? Now there are some systems in the body that allows the blood to come back up, overcoming the resistance of gravity. And one such mechanism we have is called the muscle pump. So all these muscles, when they contract and relax, it acts like a pump that allows the blood in the veins to come up. So we are using the muscles as a pump. And when we do asanas, and especially when we do alternating stretching and contraction of the muscles, we are actually using this muscle pump mechanism. And because we are systematically targeting all the major muscle groups, you can see it benefits the circulatory system as well. It makes the movement of the blood flow more brisk. Not only that, it also has two other mechanisms to help the heart. The second mechanism is breathing. When we take a deep breath in, so what happens is it creates a low pressure in the thoracic cavity, right? So not only that does it allow more air to fill the lungs because there's a lower pressure in the thoracic cavity, because the heart is situated in the thoracic cavity, that low pressure draws, it sucks the blood from the lower extremities, you see. So in that way, it benefits the circulatory system as well. And the third way it benefits is when we do inverted postures. What was gravitational resistance before now becomes gravitational assistance, you see. So the blood from the lower extremities, now the legs are up in the air. So the blood can easily flow to the heart without any resistance from gravity. So the point is, the practice of yoga asanas are so rich. You have such variety, a stretching of the muscles, contraction of the muscles, and then all the internal organs are massaged, they're exercised, and each system of the body are well exercised. It is truly an all-around practice. My teacher, Srivath Ramaswamiji, he calls the practice of yoga asanas Sarva Anga Sadhana. Sarvanga Sadhana. That means the practice that benefits all parts of the body. So in that sense, the contribution of yoga asanas is very unique. And if we were to capture one benefit, the core benefit of asanas, Patanjali actually captures that in one sutra. Of course, asanas has multitude of benefits, but Patanjali says the main benefit as far as quieting the mind is concerned is the practice of asanas reduces rajogunam. It reduces restlessness in the system. So the turbulent flow of prana in the system becomes more tranquil flow. So he says, Prashantavahita samskarat. Prashant, there is a flow of peace, peaceful circulation, not just of the blood, but also circulation of the prana in the system that happens. And all the dvandvas or the ups and downs in the mind or the restlessness in the body, they settle down. It allows the body and mind to settle down. So that is the primary benefit of asanas. And some of the other scriptures also talk about other benefits, like for example, the Hatha Yoga Pratipika. It gives three benefits for asanas. It says Angalagavam, which means lightness of the body, and then Sthiryam, the body becomes more stable and strong, and then Arogyam, that means freedom from disease. So many benefits are there for yoga, and it's so unique. This practice is so unique, and especially when we integrate with all the other angas of the Ashtanga Yoga, it becomes such a powerful practice. It creates a platform for incredible and exuberant health to blossom in our life.
I think that's incredibly well said, and hopefully leaves our audience with really the punchline of this podcast episode and what we've tried to convey, which is just that when you think about asanas and even go into asanas, right, you should be thinking multidimensionally as opposed to just on a single dimension, just the physical dimension, right? Because like you so nicely encapsulated, Shriramji, at the end, there is so much more that asanas touch upon, right? Than just barely this, very superficial physical practice that we think about on a very day-to-day level, right? So I think as long as our audience takes that, away from this episode, I hope we will have done our jobs here. But to our audience, I hope that you were able to take something out of this podcast, and these are all really great tips and tricks that you can start to integrate into your yoga toolkit. And so next time they're on the mat practicing and you're looking at going into one final position of one particular posture, you'll hopefully be thinking about all these different processes that are going on in the background, physically, mentally, and beyond, in order to then help refine your practice and get into the best final state, which touches upon so many different levels and so many different dimensions, as you mentioned before. So with that, unless you have any other closing thoughts, Shriramji, why don't we go ahead and close our discussion for today, and we will pick it back up again next week, where we'll hopefully talk about pranayama and the breathing side of things, and how this equates within the Ashtanga Yoga philosophy, and what role pranayama and breathing has in a yoga toolkit holistically.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it, Vedanji. And in fact, we will discover how the benefits of pranayama are slightly different from the benefits of asanas, and how they beautifully complement each other. And in fact, how each of the angas, each of the limbs of the Ashtanga Yoga, they have their unique role to play. They have their unique benefit that they provide to the system, and how they all nicely fit together.
Wonderful. So with that, that's hopefully our incentive for the audience and the listeners to tune in again next week to the next session of the podcast. But with that, why don't we go ahead and wrap up for today? So thank you, Shriramji, for this wonderful explanation, and thank you to our audience for listening to the podcast. And we look forward to seeing you all next week as usual.
Thank you.
Thank you.